What happens when 250 pirates swarm a single US Navy tanker designed only to carry fuel and not to fight? And what if those pirates arrive armed with RPGs, DSHK heavy machine guns, and a strategy to ignite 8 million gallons of jet fuel in seconds? The answer is a firefight unlike any seen on the seas in decades. Stay with us, because what began as the Navy's worst nightmare turned into a decisive demonstration of US power that no pirate group would forget. Before we move on, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and like the video. How could a cluster of poor fishermen scattered along the Somali coastline transform into something resembling an organized navy? The answer begins with a figure who never set out in the small skiffs himself, but who supplied the money, weapons, and reach that turned desperation into discipline. His name was Khaled Khadar Abdul Raman, and in the fishing towns, people whispered about him as a coastal warlord. He was not the kind who barked orders in the middle of a fight. Instead, he operated from a distance, moving between compounds, counting stacks of dollars wired in from shadowy partners abroad, and buying what local bandits could never afford: heavy weapons, long-range radios, satellite phones, and enough diesel fuel to keep dozens of boats chasing targets hundreds of miles out. Through him, the once fractured pirate groups gained a single hand directing them. For years, the Western image of a pirate was a man in rags clutching an AK-47, boarding a slow freighter to snatch sailors and hold them until ransom arrived. That picture never explained what happened on the night when 36 fast attack boats set out in rehearsed formation. This was not random greed. It was the execution of a plan. The pirates had welded steel frames onto speedboats to mount DSHK heavy machine guns. They had crates of RPG-7 launchers, some with tandem-charge warheads meant for armor, now turned against fuel tanks. Boat crews wore military-style webgear with chest-rig pouches, magazines stacked in rows. Even their movement across the water resembled training, with boats keeping equal spacing as if maneuvering in tight patterns was second nature. The scale of it erased the idea of petty raids. When those engines opened up, the sea itself seemed to boil. More than 250 men packed into the skiffs and mother boats, roaring toward a single target, a US Navy tanker named Guadalupe. It carried over 8.2 million gallons of jet fuel, turning the vessel into the most volatile object on the Indian Ocean that night. The crew were merchant sailors with Navy support, men accustomed to valves, piping systems, and fuel transfers, not firefights in the dark. On deck, sailors scrambled to shut hatches and secure equipment, eyes wide as streaks of tracer fires zipped across the water. They were facing what looked to them less like pirates and more like a small Navy squadron. Later investigations pieced together where the sudden strength had come from. Records uncovered through bank tracing showed more than $50 million passed through offshore accounts linked to Abdul Raman. The transactions funded new weapons, trained men, and even payments to officials looking the other way. Entire villages pulled into the system, some providing food, others servicing engines, many dealing with fuel shipments stored in hidden coastal bunkers. It was an operation silently built for years, surfacing all at once against one of the most dangerous targets imaginable. On the Guadalupe, panic broke out as the first rocket-propelled grenade slammed into the stern. The explosion ripped apart ladders, tore open metal plating, and set fire to deck equipment. Flames licked upward with the wind pushing, edging dangerously close to pipes feeding the massive storage tanks. Crewmen grabbed extinguishers, dousing areas already glowing orange, knowing if the fire jumped into the fuel system, the entire ship would vanish in a single fireball. And still, the pirates pressed harder, rifles cracking from less than 50 meters away. This was not opportunism. It was warfare at sea, directed by a man who had no intention of demanding petty ransom when he could cripple global shipping by targeting its lifeblood, fuel. Under Abdul Rahman's command, piracy had broken free from its image as disorganized and desperate. It stood rebuilt into a paramilitary force, and that forced the United States into a new role, not only protecting its vessels, but confronting an enemy gathering strength like an army. If pirates could evolve to strike with the weight of hundreds, how would the US Navy answer on both water and land? That was the next test. With pirates converging from 10 directions at once, the tanker sat exposed in the water like an open wound. How the US Navy managed to flip that moment of near disaster into complete dominance is a story of speed, firepower, and coordination under pressure. The Guadalupe wasn't just another ship to escort. It was essentially a floating bomb, carrying millions of gallons of aviation fuel. If even one warhead had broken deeper into its tanks, the explosion would have gone up like a small city vaporizing in seconds. That knowledge weighed on every sailor on deck as the first minutes of the attack unfolded. The chaos was immediate. Rockets streaked across the darkness, slamming into guardrails and scattering shrapnel across the deck. The blast waves threw sailors to the floor while flaming debris cut into the non-armored sections of the ship. Shrapnel tore into arms and legs, and the cries of the wounded echoed as others rushed to drag them below. Gunners stumbled into their firing positions, hands bleeding, barely managing to swing heavy weapons into place to fire down at speedboats weaving across the black water. They were fighting against numbers more suited to land combat, and every shot counted. Relief came from the escort ship assigned to shadow the tanker, the USS Cape St. George. The cruiser had tracked the incoming swarm on radar and moved into a firing stance. Within moments, its Phalanx systems lit the sea with streams of 20-millimeter fire, cutting across the surface with mechanical precision. Thousands of rounds shredded pirate skiffs, lighting them up in bursts of orange as fuel and ammunition cooked off. At the same time, 50-caliber machine guns mounted along the rails hammered into wooden boats, splintering hulls in seconds and leaving engines silent as skiffs capsized one after another. It was controlled brutality, and it started to tilt the odds. The fight didn't stay contained at sea. Reinforcements launched out of Djibouti once the scale of the attack was made clear. Patrol drones arrived first, circling overhead, feeding infrared images of clusters of boats and firing positions. Apache helicopters followed, their rotors thumping into the battle zone. Each helicopter carried rocket pods and cannons, dropping low to blast through groups of boats that hadn't yet been swept by naval fire. Behind them came Chinooks packed with Navy SEALs. They weren't only reinforcing the tanker's defense, they were headed to push the fight onto land. Intelligence gathered in real time pointed toward Naval, a compound several miles inland. Drones and surveillance had located fortified warehouses serving as staging grounds. Inside were heavy machine guns set up on sandbagged positions, caches of rockets, fuel drums stacked in rows, and the radio equipment used to coordinate attacks out at sea. It was the command hub that allowed pirates to launch in organized waves rather than individual raids. Leaving it intact meant the swarm would come again. The counterstrike unfolded with speed. SEALs dropped in by air while Apaches poured fire into the perimeter. Black smoke rose from the warehouses as Hellfire missiles detonated fuel stores. The Cape St. George joined in, firing naval gun rounds that smashed defensive positions into rubble. Rooms where captives had been held were cleared one by one as commandos moved through using flashbangs and suppressive fire. In less than 3 hours, the stronghold that once directed the largest pirate raid in history lay destroyed. What began as a raid for ransom ended as proof that piracy had evolved into organized warfare, and that the U.S. was ready to dismantle both the flotilla at sea and the command bunkers inland. The message wasn't just about protecting one tanker. It showed that America could strike the roots of a covert war machine in hours. But if $50 million and a few hundred fighters nearly crippled shipping, what happens when a state-backed force brings 10 times the firepower? Global trade depends on those sea lanes. Stay with us as we break down future naval operations shaping their survival.